over the last 2.5 days. It struck me that certain words kept coming up over and over again. One was unconscious self, that which is suppressed in this society, or getting in touch with our inner self. And the other word that kept coming up over and over, and I've used it many times, is language, the power of language. And I thought therein lay a groundwork for a practical outcome in some regards. And I wrote down a short sentence before I get to these couple of slides. And I asked myself, how do we use language and images combined? And I was reminded of Galen's talk this morning. I thought those were really powerful images. How do we combine language and images to help us, not me, I mean all of us collectively, society in general, get in touch with our inner selves? In other words, spark that sensitivity to reconnect with themselves and with the rest of nature, without necessarily a sales pitch to go with it, but rather some way of provoking a person to sort of embark on a journey that begins to get them in touch with oneself. And then you could start adding taglines to that in some way. But I thought there's got to be a panoply of things you could use to provoke. Certainly in therapy, you do it all the time. You've got ways of provoking. And I think there's a combination of language and images that could be, perhaps, arguably, deployed to try to provoke. So that, and the point of this is that it's not done with respect to a single issue, but that there are many issues on the horizon, and what we need is a pervasive sort of, well, I hope that people have a way of getting in touch with themselves and such nature, and perhaps that begins to make it easier to address issues like this. Global warming today, what tomorrow? Not that global warming is going away today or tomorrow, but nonetheless, it's not the only issue out there. And yet we have to go back to these same people and make a sales pitch once again about, oh, what do we do about this? So I just wonder if there isn't a way of provoking something deeper that, in doing so, leaves that person more open to the kinds of discussions about the kinds of issues we're facing. Climate change being one of them. There are many other issues. That's my 2 cents on that. And I don't mean to labor this, and I won't. Let me just go through a couple of slides. Here's some documents that were leaked. They've been leaked from various industry. This one's from the American Petroleum Institute. The date on it is 1998. But you can see here where the emphasis here on the strategy behind the leaked document is to underscore uncertainty, elevate uncertainty with respect to global climate change, force the media to reflect on one of its principles, which is balance. And we're trying to get media to move away from this notion of balance. And these people understand media enough to know to provoke that sense of balance in media. Again, I don't want to dwell on these. I'd be glad to give anybody a copy of this tactics. Hire the usual skeptics to go out there and get in the top 20 media markets, get you on radio, television, newsprint. We're going to sort of open the doors to you. Get John Stossel on board to do a TV presentation on ABC, organize, promote grassroots organizations. Senator Inhofe, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this statement. The threat of catastrophic global warming is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated. You've heard that. That's been picked up by the news many times now. This you may not have heard of. This film that basically was a parody of Al Gore's film, showed up on an amateur website, a video webcast. It turns out that the Wall Street Journal did some investigation. The person who put this parody film on here wasn't a person at all, but a large public relations institution in Washington, D.C. They were the ones behind it. They floated it as if it was an amateur contributing to the site.
Yeah.
Turns out not only that, but they go on to say down here, we do this stuff, and defend it sort of without impunity about And we do this stuff all the time. Anyway, it was to raise doubts about global warming, to make fun of the, this is one of those things that you don't see because it presents itself as a very harmless amateur doing this, and then it turns out it's much more sophisticated. This is recent too, another leaked document from the International Rural Electric Power Institute. We're going to hire climate skeptics like Pat Michaels, give them $100,000 a year. Go on and on. And I found this interesting in the document that was leaked, that it makes a reference to the Competitive Enterprise Institute that's been running 2 ads in 10 states, financed by General Motors and Ford Motor Company. Well, Ford and General Motors, needless to say, denied having done that, but in such a way as to not make it credible. If you read the language carefully, here again is the point of the power of language. It's not exactly a denial. Bill Gray, professor in Colorado State, again repeating this. Anyway, these are just some questions I thought I'd leave you with a cartoon. There you go. I want to leave you with this cartoon.
Could you read it for us?
Here we go. Science privatization. Everyone would be entitled to set up their own personal science facts. And pretty much by and large, this is essentially what happens when, in the end, because the average person continues to ask me and other scientists like Jeff, is global warming real? I mean, how basic a question could you get from a person? Is it real? And so the power of language comes home once again. I mean, the real power of language.
I guess this is a question that we can explore tomorrow that I've really wondered about. To what extent is the media complicit in spreading this confusion?
Well, now you're getting into harder. Why?
But let's leave that for tomorrow.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it.
So in essence, I think, are you actually suggesting that we all need to just be a little bit more provocative?
What do you mean by provocative?
Well, you use the word provoke, and I'm listening to the words you use, and giving examples here of the one perspective that is using provocation.
Well, perhaps in a benign way. In other words, I'm not provoking you to sort of lead you down the trail, but I am provoking you to open yourself up to the world more than you
Can I
have.
mention provoking for just one moment? Because we love to do that. We in our series, we actually have to answer the questions that have been asked today. We have to put images together, and we're not talking to a small audience. We're talking to a global audience, a national audience for PBS, and then a global audience. And it's very hard. We know we're not talking to a small constituency. So coming up with these images is really, really tough. Whether we deal with difficult, grieving questions of nature or euphoric images of communities that have solved a problem. But there's a little preview of what you'll see on Friday, because our presentation now has changed completely. Like everybody else's. Our office in Washington keeps asking for different videos to come in so we can piece this together. But in the evolution of our show, we had to become more and more provocative, we felt. And there was a sequence, we knew we wanted to do a case study of the Salton Sea in California, the largest inland body of water in California, and one of the greatest byways on the West Coast for birds. It's just an enormously important place that is, because of a variety of reasons, and we'll show you the sequence, I guess, but it's dying. And we needed to talk about the significance of the death of this ecozone and how it can affect people. And in order to do this, Marilyn and I thought long and hard, and we felt as if to really be provocative, we had to go to Uzbekistan. And fortunately, we had the funds from NSF to do this. By telling the story of the RLC, we all of a sudden, it dawned on the people of Palm Springs when we told the story. They said, oh my God. Because we all of a sudden we tell a story of the worst environmental catastrophe in modern times, including Chernobyl, was the RLC. The number of deaths from that is just enormous. So we went there to tell the Palm Springs story and provoke people. So think about provoking people.
I'd love to extend the question that you asked, like, what should scientists do? I actually think it's really important that we ask not only, what's the role of media in creating these kinds of things, but what's the role in science in allowing this, and being actually quite the collaborators in that, in my view. But I think more generally, after the discussion we've had here, and sort of understanding that science often can be in the dark side, can hide things, can make things invisible. What should our role become? I mean, we have to obviously transform science very deeply as well, and how do we do that? In some ways, with our sort of claim toward at least pursuing the truth, whatever that is, we have to give up that privileged position in society. And social sciences have long talked about sort of the in this postmodern, post-structuralist argument about that we never really had that privileged position in a sort of real sense. But we ought to think hard of, like, when we have to give that up, then what do we have to allow to emerge, as the parallel truths, and how do we, what is then the right position of science in society? What can we realistically expect? What is it good for? Where is the limit? And how do we practice that being scientists? And I actually want to extend that to saying it's not just the physical scientists. I think social scientists have been in some ways miserable at the communication side, have been miserable in conveying what we do know about social change, about communication, whatever. Both of us, both parts of the scientific community, I think, need to be included in that.
If I could just say one thing to kind of contextualize it, all of my work on climate change, national level surveys, state level surveys, international work, all of it, we always ask the question of who do you trust to tell you the truth about global warming? And we'll ask this for religious groups, corporations, politicians, the media, scientists, environmental groups. Okay? And always, scientists are by far the most trusted group. And that's critical because this is a topic, as we all know, is incredibly complex and difficult and hard to understand, and it's just one of 1,000 other risks that we all don't really understand well enough to make informed decisions about. And so who you trust becomes really important for how you ultimately respond to any kind of risk.
But that's an interesting...
And so all I'm saying about that is that I think that puts a special responsibility on scientists to speak. And unfortunately, I think one of the biggest problems is that scientists themselves won't let themselves speak. There was just a survey out a couple weeks ago from England in which they surveyed scientists and asked them, would you communicate to the media? Would you communicate to the public? And one of the primary reasons why scientists don't do it, 80% said, is because scientists who do that aren't credible scientists.
Yeah, I guess my personal experience is I far more enjoy talking to the public than I do to the media.
And kudos, great.
You're an exception,
But you're an exception.
Because I know when I talk to the media, after they talk to me, they'll go and call one of those guys that was up there, and the person's going to read an article which says, Jeff Keel says there's global warming, Pat Michael says it's a farce. And they're left with, oh, these guys don't know what they're doing.
But at least they heard Jeff Keel.
Yeah.
I think that scientists blame the media as almost like just a knee-jerk reaction and a mantra. But if you, many journalists are past the idea that they have to show both sides in an argument if in fact there's a clear consensus. But often the problem is that if you imagine a jigsaw puzzle that you're putting together and all these pieces are there, scientists may be very clear on what the overall picture of the jigsaw puzzle is, but they argue ferociously about where two tiny pieces in that puzzle fit. And that confuses the public because instead of saying what they do agree on, they focus on the minutia of what they don't agree on without any context of what we all agree on.
We've heard some of that over the last couple of days.
And I just love the image of the big jigsaw puzzle on the table and the fighting about the two little pieces over here, which makes everybody think that in fact you don't have any agreement at all on what the overall picture is.
But isn't that really an attempt to try to keep their argument with themselves? That the way that scientists argue is to actually avoid the conflict of the world, and to realize I have to take this out to the world. I think scientists have been trained in a context in which they haven't had enough conflict, so they don't get accustomed to speaking like, well, you just get off. Well, actually, I hear these are actually conflictual conferences. But
Well, yeah, I think any good scientist really enjoys a good, vigorous debate. One is very well-known atmospheric chemist once said, atmospheric science is a contact sport. So I don't think they shy away from it. I think the problem is it's the communities, that they are very adept at arguing amongst themselves around these minutiae. And then they forget that they need to change their message and the way they present the message when they leave the conference of scientists and go out and talk to the media or the public. They can't use that, well, you know, it could be this, or and what they're talking about is minutia. They're not giving the big holistic picture of this is what we really are certain of, and we really know, and we have a lot of confidence in. And focus on that. Okay? Here's what we see as happening in the world. Here's what we have a lot of confidence in terms of our models and what they can predict and what they can reproduce. And stop. Don't go into, and then there's this little issue, could change my results by 10% here, or 15. You know, at that point, the confusion enters the room and they've lost their audience.
well, not just stop, not just stop, but also move back into what I've heard in this conference is, you know, this means something to me.
Well, that's something I was hoping we would get to, which is, and I don't know the answer to this. I did some of this on Monday. It was interesting to see Carolyn's response when I used the word the memory of the ocean. She said her first reaction was, what is he talking about? He's a scientist. He can't, you know, animate the ocean and give it a memory. But I really did that on purpose because I wanted to use that metaphor because people understand it. They can grasp that we're doing something to the ocean that the ocean is storing and will return to us, just like a memory. And I think scientists need to start playing with their language so that they can reach out more to people. And I'm hoping, and this is my question, do we become less of a scientist if we start doing that? Do we become less than what we're supposed to be if we start using language other than plots, bar charts, time series, and tables of numbers? Is that something scientists should be doing more of, or would it really destroy the profession? And we would start dropping. And on your polls, would scientists start dropping down? That trusting level.
We need to stop. I'd hate to. We need maybe about 2 minutes. Is that what you were?
No, I know.
Now we got the floor.
3 or 4 minutes.
What both Susie and Jeff were saying, just in my own experience of 17 years of about 800 scientists coming here from all over the world to have meetings like this, there is a shift. 20 years ago, Carl Sagan and Steve Schneider, they would get a lot of garbage about this from the science community, not from anybody else. They became heroes to other people. And yet, I see that this is evolving, it's changing, very slowly, but it's changing. And I think it's a very positive thing, because scientists realize that they have to do this now. That the rate of change of getting a message out is too slow. And I see it every year.
Well, that's a good point in terms of the evolution, slow changes over time, because when we embarked, myself and a colleague, on the series of workshops to bring scientists and media together, there were many reasons why, one of which was to know something about the other's culture, the other was to sort of work out these issues that were plaguing scientists about journalism and stuff like that. And the other, in my part, my sense was, I have a sense of deja vu. In other words, we've been here before. We were here with the ozone issue, we were here with the dioxin issue. Here we are going around the same circle again with climate. Why are we doing this? Why? If we've been around this circle at least 3 times, why can't we break the circle? And so I assumed that since most people, by all the surveys, get their information from the media, that we needed, as a start, a conversation with the media to see if we could alter behavior. But not only the media, but alter the culture of science as well. So we were looking for deeper roots to a problem that I thought was not confined to a single issue, but transcended many issues, and that we would have to face this issue again if we didn't start dealing with the fundamental roots of the problem now.
I wanted to go back to Jeff's question, because to me that's a key. And you phrased it as scientists have to become less scientific. I don't think they should do that. I think science has given us wonderful knowledge, but it doesn't assuage our sorrow. The book, The Battle for God by Karen Armstrong, situates the rise of the great conflicts of the 3 great religions of the world as having to do with a language of the scientific technological world that takes away the language of belief. And she says, the language of fact will not assuage our sorrow. I'll give one concrete example. We know the facts about death. Think of when somebody that you love has died. You know, maybe it was a virus, maybe it was this. We should know that. That's good knowledge. But we also need another way of speaking about that same event. And I think that's what we have to look for, is another voice that talks about the same thing, but from a different perspective. And it is not invalidated because it's not science.
I just want to interject something. I hate generalizations. To go back to the media, there are really great reporters, journalists that I'm happy to speak with because I really trust them. I know that they're going to do a good job. So I don't want to say all journalists, all the media is participates in this practice.
Not you, of course.
I was going to suggest that maybe there should be some division of labor. I mean, the scientist has 2 really strong cards. One is the truth and the other is trust. And if you start talking, it really creeps me out to hear people talking about manipulating images to change people's unconscious. I mean, that's not the job of a scientist at all. There are people out there who are paid to do that. I'd say educate the scientists to be even better at playing their strong cards. Don't put them into grief work. Don't put them into, mass market manipulation. Let them do what they do best. I mean, that'll serve you in the long run.
Yeah, well, I mean, we didn't flesh out this idea of images and language. I mean, I think that you have to sort of come out of these discussions.
One last.
Yeah, I just want to put this in a bit more political perspective. If you look at the last 4 years, what's happened in America, first was a thorough debunking of the left. The left voice has been infantilized, really, over the last 30 or 40 years. There's no meaningful left in America anymore, unless you read The Nation, Second, who came after the left was the Greens, because the Greens asked you to rethink property in the commons, which calls attention to state capitalism, and so they were thoroughly debunked. And who's left critiquing the state are the scientists, because scientists are calling attention to a certain type of reality that really is criticizing corporate America now. So there's been a systematic attempt on the part of the Bush administration over the last 3 or 4 years to thoroughly debunk science. And it's not only happening at the level of the press, but it's also happening at the level of our schools. We are growing a generation of students who just cannot think clearly about science. this is unbelievable to me. This is an Orwellian nightmare. And so I think scientists have an obligation to reach out to the public in terms of high school education, elementary school education, across the board. This is not about two languages anymore. This is about the systematic debunking of science as a way of critiquing the state. And we've got to put it in that perspective, because once that's gone, I don't know what we have left. I really don't. All the interesting questions about language and narrative and the unconscious, which are obviously really important and relevant, this has been dealt with a lot of really interesting literature. A guy named David Takacs wrote a book called The Idea of Biodiversity about 10 years ago, in which he interviewed about 30 conservation biologists and ecologists about their values in relationship to addressing the public. And does an advocacy role threaten the sanctity of their science? And almost consistently across the board, most of those scientists said no, that it's a time for advocacy now. We have no other choice to do it, yet they can still be excellent scientists. So that's all I wanted to say, is that, you guys, we need science education. Anything that any scientist can do at any point to get out to a high school or an elementary school or speak to the public, just to promote why this way of thinking is helpful, is really important.
Thanks very much. I think we need to stop. Yeah.